and I want to welcome everyone. My name is Evgeny Dengub, and I am happy to resume our ACTR webinar series. Before we start, I would like to invite everyone who hasn't had a chance to come to our Teachers Lounge meetings, informal gatherings that we do 4 times a month, right? Twice for K-12 folks and twice for college, where we discuss various issues. And the topic for last month was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to continue this topic. We're going to talk about race, and we're going to talk about equitable grading. So if you're interested in these topics, I invite you to join us, and you could see the schedule of the webinars of those lounges on ACTR website. But today, I'm happy to present to you our guest, Ekaterina Nemtchinova, who is a professor in the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Linguistics at Seattle Pacific University, where she currently teaches linguistics courses and used to teach Russian language, literature, and culture. Her research interests include teacher education, particularly the issues of non-native English-speaking professionals in TESOL, and technology in language teaching. She was named Professor of the Year at Seattle Pacific University in 2018. Congratulations. And her latest article on developing intercultural competence in the Russian language class was published as part of the Art of Teaching Russian volume in 2020. In addition to articles and book chapters, she published a Russian language textbook, Послушайте, in 2018, and Teaching Listening, TESOL, in 2013 and 2020. So Katya, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And everybody, once again, please type your questions in the chat, and then we'll have a chance to converse after Katya's presentation. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Zhenya. Greetings from Seattle, everybody. My topic today is intercultural competence, so I'm going to start with something truly original. Intercultural competence is an important goal of foreign language education. I mean, how many times have you heard it? We all know it. Every professional document or publication in our field gives it a prominent place. To meet the national standard of producing interculturally competent speakers of Russian means that in addition to having enough language to communicate with target language speakers, our students need to understand their cultural ideas, opinions, and attitudes, and to be able to express themselves in a culturally appropriate way. Well, while preparing for this webinar, I went online and looked at a number of Russian course syllabi at different schools and for different levels. Each of them mentions culture or intercultural in some way, although there is not a lot of detail about exactly what will be done in this respect. And this is understandable. Intercultural competence is a complex phenomenon. There is a number of definitions in the literature, but no agreement on what exactly it is made of. You see some recent definitions on the slide. Intercultural competence is a complex of abilities needed to perform effectively and appropriately when interacting with others who are linguistically and culturally different from oneself, and it's quite a mouthful. These abilities could be developed by acquiring the culture-specific and culture-general knowledge, skills, and attitudes required for effective communication and interaction with other cultures. It is a dynamic, developmental, and ongoing process which engages the learner cognitively, behaviorally, and effectively. No doubt that intercultural competence, or IC, is a complex construct. You can find 325 interpersonal, communicative, and cultural components of IC in the literature. In addition to factual knowledge, the cognitive domain, there's also behavior, the behavioral domain, and attitudes and beliefs, the affective domain. The question is how our understanding of intercultural competence translates into concrete teaching objectives, what it is that we want to accomplish in our classroom, and how the learning outcomes should be assessed. And this is my purpose for today. I want to briefly look at a couple of different models of intercultural competence discuss teaching and assessment issues, and then show you what can be done to integrate intercultural objectives and assessment practices into traditional language learning activities to promote intercultural development. I'm going to focus on the first and second year Russian at a college level, but the principles that we're going to talk about apply to any level of instruction. During the presentation, you are welcome to put your questions and comments into the chat, and we will take a couple of breaks to answer questions and allow time for additional questions from you at the end. The presentation and discussion is in English, but if you feel more comfortable with Russian, go ahead and ask your question in Russian, and I'll try and do my best to answer the questions in the language that they were written. So let's start with some theory. There have been several attempts to conceptualize and assess intercultural competence in a systematic way. A developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, DMIS, was proposed by Milton Bennett in 1993. It includes 6 developmental levels of intercultural competence, which are divided into ethnocentric and ethno-relative stages, so that a person progresses from denying the difference between cultures at the left-hand side of the screen to incorporating other worldviews into their own on the right-hand side of the screen. This model was based on the analysis of cultural communication problems of Western workers abroad and their reactions to cultural differences. So it was focused on adult professionals and not second language learners. Still, it is a popular model and a popular assessment tool, and it is still used. My university used it just last year to let the faculty know where each of us stands on diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the same time, the DMIS model has been criticized on several accounts. For one, it doesn't pay attention to linguistic content of communicative interactions, but it focuses exclusively on cultural aspects of communication. Second, it's a linear model in which the learner moves from stage to stage in a mechanical sort of way. There is no indication on how the progression from denial to integration develops. Also, this model is set to represent the point of view of the teacher, not the learner, because it ignores the question of how learners actually develop intercultural competence as they progress through various stages of the model. A very influential multidimensional model of intercultural competence was suggested by David Byram. He analyzed foreign language teaching in Europe and developed 5 key factors of intercultural competence, and you see them on the slide: attitudes, knowledge, skills of interpreting and relating, skills of discovery and interaction, and critical cultural awareness. Unlike DMIS on the previous slide, Byram's model stresses the connection between language and culture in developing intercultural speakers, and you see little arrows on the slide. But it does not say how to incorporate intercultural competence into teaching practices or how to address the knowledge, skills, and attitude components of IC in the teaching curriculum in a coherent way. His cognitive, behavioral, and affective factors remain bullet points on the list, and it is not clear how they interact with one another and with the linguistic, social linguistic, and discourse aspects of intercultural competence. A solution to these problems was offered by Adriana Diaz in 2013. She proposes the concept of critical lingua-cultural awareness. And it's not lingua, it's lingua-cultural awareness, which integrates all the different aspects of intercultural competence into language education. It's a cyclical process. It begins with raising learners' awareness of their own culture and its linguistic and social cultural rules, which are often invisible to native speakers of the language. The next step is for students to observe the differences between the native and target lingua cultures and to reflect on the nature of differences and modify their practices to accommodate this new input. And this process of noticing, reflecting, and modifying creates a continuous cycle. It should start at the very beginning of language learning. A late start will still result in cultural learning, but it may cause a prescriptive view of the target language. Diaz, in fact, insists on purposeful and systematic embedding of critical language culture awareness processes into curriculum from the very beginning of language instruction. What makes her model appealing to me is the attention to language. Critical language culture awareness involves learners using language in interaction to interpret and construct meaning and analyzing and reflecting upon this experience and continuing to learn from the use of language in intercultural interactions. This model is about locating culture and language that we are going to teach in class and making this culture visible to students. A central concept to all three models that we looked at is identity transformation in the process of IC development. Identity transformation means increased self-awareness, openness to new values, curiosity in learning about new beliefs. It means a shift in personal views, which can be a challenge. A recent research of study abroad experiences showed that one of the reasons for cultural misunderstandings is American students' lack of awareness of their own culture. They hold on to their own view of interpreting what they see and hear around them and struggle with accepting another point of view. A monolingual and monocultural identity and an inability to perceive the world through the other's language cultures is believed to be one of the main obstacles to intercultural competence development. So we as language instructors can help students to change their preconceived notions through learning and reflection, to raise their awareness of self and others, and gradually modify their expectations and communication behaviors. Those who write about intercultural competence often highlight the recursive, circular nature of its development. It is not a straight path from zero IC to full IC. It's a spiral progression through different stages accompanied by gradual growth. It is a permanent work in progress that constantly transforms in response to new experiences and reflections on them. The process is not easy. Claire Cramsh, who has written a lot on language and culture, suggests that the development of intercultural competence involves conflict. It is a struggle between the learner's meanings and those of the native speakers. Encounters with a foreign culture can create feelings of anxiety and uncertainty. But if students analyze the source of anxiety and focus on their reactions to the host culture, they can control their anxiety and develop mindfulness, which again underscores the importance of identity transformation in IC development. So how do existing models of IC inform foreign language teaching? What can we actually do to develop intercultural competence in a Russian language classroom? Literature stresses the need for learner-centered, interactive, collaborative classroom where students are actively involved in the process of cultural exploration. Ideally, our students would be eager to share native and target cultural experiences, make comparisons, and critically reflect on cultural values and practices. The instructor in an ideal classroom acts as a facilitator who guides students through the process of cultural exploration. Simply conveying cultural facts is not enough. The teacher is expected to help students discover the core meaning behind these facts. As we present artifacts or cultural events in class, we should invite students to notice, compare, build connections, and reflect. And as they engage in discussion, we monitor their progress and provide feedback. What happens in real life language classroom? Not this. It seems that there is a certain gap between the theory and research on intercultural competence and teaching practices to realize it. And our textbooks do not help. If you look at the popular first and second year Russian textbooks, such as Troika, Голоса, Начало, and В пути, you'll see that they contain culture boxes and come with supplemental PowerPoints and video clips. Teachers also bring cultural objects and food to classes, play songs, show videos, and students love this. And this is certainly better than nothing. But you can see how culture is presented as a series of isolated facts and distinct behaviors of some generalized target population. So textbooks are telling students what an average Russian person does in this or that situation so that students could act accordingly. In practice, this systematic account of cultural data does not really help students deal with situations of cultural misunderstanding. This is called the cognitive approach to teaching culture. Claire Cramsch suggests that cognitive approach can lead to stereotyping, so that students end up with some fixed, generalized, and inaccurate account of the target culture. When we present culture in isolation and with reference to some universal target population, we do very little to develop students' understanding of cultural phenomena. What happens is students learn about the culture, not how to interact with it, which is extremely important for those who are planning to live and work in a new cultural environment. Another challenge for intercultural competence development is the curriculum. The teaching and learning of culture does not enjoy the same curricular presence as the language. Both research studies and empirical evidence show the low importance of culture in the language curriculum. We tend to focus on grammar and vocabulary and often pay little attention to the cultural information. Even when we practice culturally appropriate behaviors in role plays and interactive activities, they mainly target the language, the linguistic means of expression, and overlook students' perceptions of the similarities between the two cultures. It has also been noted that cultural instruction is usually restricted to the 4 Fs: food, fairs, folklore, and statistical facts, or the fine arts. I've been teaching beginning and intermediate Russian for over 20 years, and for the most part, I was very happy with the cognitive approach to teaching culture. I'd ask students to read culture boxes or watch the cultural video clip in the Troika textbook, and I would answer their questions if they had them, or if I have time. We make a field trip to a Russian restaurant every year. I show a video recording of the Russian Orthodox Easter service and bring kulich and pascha to class. I invite native speaking guest speakers to talk to my students. I play songs. I include other cultural activities into my syllabus. Occasionally, I would ask students to compare a certain aspect of Russian American culture, but I was never intentional about it. And still, I was convinced that I was teaching the Russian culture. And then several years ago, I heard a conference presentation and then read a book by Adriana Diaz, which changed my outlook on how I should go about intercultural competence in my Russian class. Diaz's model of critical language cultural awareness struck me as something worth trying to do, particularly when I thought about how my students perk up when we do something cultural in class. They appreciate every chance to learn more about the Russian way. So I wanted to use their motivation to try and enhance my cultural instruction with this process of noticing, analyzing, and reflecting on the interplay of the two cultures. I really like the idea of encouraging students to construct a new cultural knowledge rather than simply taking it in. So now, when we come across a cultural box in the textbook, I ask students in class to read it silently and think about how it compares to an American way. I invite questions and comments on the content, and I ask those students who have been to Russia to share their insights about this particular aspect of the Russian culture. I also offer my perspective on the issue in question, saying that the book offers the generalized, approved, the mainstream view, while mine is strictly personal and somewhat limited because I grew up under the Soviet Union, left the country 20 years ago. I visited every 2 years, and most importantly, I'm the same age as my students' parents. What percent of the Russian population do I represent? But still, I believe that this discussion is very valuable because it offers several different perspectives on a given cultural topic and allows cross-cultural comparisons. Instead of transmitting the cultural information, I try to make students investigate it. And I can see how they start making inquiries into their own and the Russian culture and notice differences in cultural values depending on the social position, age, and so on, and how complex these cultural values are. Which brings me to the problem of class time. Finding time for cultural discussions is difficult. We often feel that discussing culture takes time away from teaching language that needs to be learned for communicative practices, and we feel guilty about it. Russian is not an easy language to learn, and it requires a lot of practice. And yet I'm willing to take time away from practice and discuss some, abstract cultural issues. So one solution to the problem of time is to have a part or all of the discussion online. This will allow students to respond at their time and pace, to think about what they're going to say with no rush and actually say it. And shy students can contribute to the discussion as well. Also, many students find online discussions appealing because of their experiences with social networks. They prefer typing. So that's one way discussing cultural issues online. Also, for many project type activities that I'm going to talk about later, a large part of research, analysis, and reflection can happen outside of class as part of the homework so that you don't have to interrupt the regular language work in class. Also, some or most of the cultural discussion can be conducted in English, in students' native language, so that they can express their ideas in more depth without searching for words and sacrificing the content. Using English for cultural discussion saves a lot of time in class. Of course, we all strive for maximum use of target language in the classroom, and yet we occasionally switch to students' native language to clarify a point, to reduce anxiety, and also to make cultural references. If you take a look at the cultural boxes in the textbook, most of the language here is in English. So we can do that too. We can take advantage of the student's mother tongue and keep a cultural conversation going. And in-class discussions do not have to be long. From my experience, just 3 to 5 minutes of class exchange of opinions creates a stimulating opportunity for students to learn about the cultural context of the language. Above all, you need to be willing to find time for cultural discussion, to carve a couple of minutes for analysis of interpretation. Tell yourself that your students are still learning the language, but just a different aspect of language. It is really worth it. Another issue that cannot be avoided when discussing the intercultural development in the Russian classroom is assessment. Assessing intercultural competence is notoriously difficult. It's a complex concept that operates with highly subjective and abstract notions. I mean, how do you evaluate empathy? Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, there is distinction between traditional and alternative assessment methods. Traditional assessment includes multiple choice, true, false, short answer, or essay type questions. Some educators claim that these formats often force students to engage in broad generalizations or stereotyping and do not lend themselves to evaluating cultural learning. These educators call for alternative forms of assessment, such as self-assessment, reflective journals, diaries, or portfolios. I have no problems with alternative assessments and often use them with my more advanced students. At the same time, I believe that traditional assessment also has a place in a language and culture classroom. I find short answer and essay type questions quite flexible. I vary direct and referential questions to address different aspects of knowledge and cognitive abilities of my students. I like true or false questions. They're very practical, especially for testing listening comprehension. Because of the nonverbal response capacity, students can just wave for yes. Traditional assessment measures are also more objective, reliable, and valid because they are more direct and less open-ended. They're easier to design and are more familiar to students. Alternative assessments, on the other hand, carry some concerns in terms of subjectivity, reliability, and validity because of the diversity of expression associated with them. The alternative assessment measures can also be time, energy consuming for the teachers to design, administer, and grade. What we have at present is this, where it says part 6, culture. This is from Nachala, I think, textbook, and it is actually part of the text. And we are lucky to have even that, because not all very often cultural knowledge is not tested at all. Not every textbook addresses it. Like we said, this, true or false tests are easy to design and grade, but do they really capture the many facets of IC and the complex ongoing processes of its development? Do they give us a glimpse of emotional or attitudinal domains of the learners? These tests focus almost exclusively on the language. They ask factual questions like "Кто такой Мусоргский?", but provide little opportunity for intercultural reflection. To develop criteria for assessing IC development, it is useful to draw on one of the existing IC models. Here are some indicators of progress that can be used in formulating the learning outcomes that include such dimensions of IC as knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So students should be expected to recognize, observe, and describe Russian cultural events, norms, and values, which we'll be noticing, compare, classify, and explain the differences between Russian American cultures, which is analysis, assess, value, and understand Russian cultural beliefs, attitudes, and perspectives, evaluation, and question, reflect on, and explain their own assumptions as well as Russian cultural norms, which is reflection. To obtain a record of students' progress toward IC goals, we can create IC performance criteria and assign a numeric value to each to represent different levels of performance. Here's a good example of such a rubric. It's Intercultural Knowledge and Competence Value rubric, and the link to it is on the handout, which I'm going to send to you in the chat. So you'll have access to it. So something like that is a good example of IC assessment, which could be adapted to your own specific classroom needs. Setting assessment rubrics makes IC expectations transparent for students and for administrators. It also helps instructors define success criteria in explicit terms. The score provides a quantifiable summative measure of learning. It can also be used formatively to get evidence of students' IC knowledge and skills. The score can give us an insight into individual IC processes and serve as a guide for student improvement. I want to stop here and get out of the screen sharing mode and see if there are any questions in chat up to this point. Anything you want to ask? Here is a question: how does one decide what is normative to the Russian culture? After all, we all have several ethnic traditions that take place at different times of the year. There are also different political and spiritual traditions. Daria, this is a very good question, and I was thinking about it as I was preparing for this webinar. It's rather difficult for a native speaker, a native bearer of the culture, to verbalize something that we've been living with since birth. What really helped me is looking at some printed sources in Russian and in English that talk specifically about Russian culture. I have какие мы русские, тайны русской души, русские с первого взгляда, как мы живем in Russian, and also Guide to Modern Russian, Cambridge Companion to Modern Russian Culture in English. So books like that help you to pinpoint some tangible issues in the Russian culture and verbalize them for students. Also, I don't even know if we can talk about normative in the Russian culture. And I think our students will appreciate more if you give them your own personal account. So I grew up in this place, and this is what my parents do and my friends do and children of my friends do versus probably some other place. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Oh, yes. Very good. Mm-hmm.
Irina asks if we can trust these sources to not uphold the dominant Rusko-centric perspective. I think, again, your own perspective and a grain of salt and your knowledge of the context really helps. Russia is a melting pot. Take, for example, a famous concept of Russian dacha. Every publication, every source on Russian culture will tell you that this concept of the notion of dacha is central to Russian culture, but there's so many dachas. There's 6 соток, участок в садовом товариществе that my parents have, or a stone mansion on several, I don't know, acres that new Russians have, or some other variety. Again, it's personal. That's why I don't like very much the generalized image of culture that is given in the textbook. So it's a great basis, but then we need to personalize it. Tatiana, given my own account. So Daria says that Тайна русской душа is very dated category, comes up in every source that is out there. I give them my own account and tell them that there are other perspectives. This is exactly what Welsh should be doing. Give them, a broader view and then your own, and maybe they have their own view. And this is what it means to reflect on the culture. Петербург опустел, все на даче. Pushkin, да. What kind of dacha did he have in mind? Definitely different from what my parents have. My sister has now. Any other questions?
There was a question from Irina.
How can you create objective criteria for assessment in view of what you are saying? I think that even the most objective criteria of assessment are subjective to a certain point, particularly when it comes to alternative assessment. So what helps is to keep in mind what you want your students to be able to do, whether it is noticing, analyzing, or reflecting, or some other aspect of intercultural competence development, and going from there. Let me send you my handout so that you can access the rubric and see if it is helpful. Irina Zaykovskaya says that I don't mean the need to personalize, but rather the need to decolonize the perspective. Most of those culture boxes create a false equivalency between the Russian language and ethnic Russian traditions, folklore, elite, or between the Russian language and Orthodox Christianity. I agree. I agree so much. In fact, I have to tell my students that, you know, as somebody who's from Moscow, I do not represent the entire population of Russia. I, on the contrary, represent a very narrow circle of people. But it's all in our hands. So we have the textbook, but then we have our knowledge and other sources, and we can guide students in the direction of, you know, comparing and contrasting. I think I'll go on, and we'll stop again soon for more questions, and there will be another opportunity to ask questions in the end. So let me get back to my slides, and so what I want to do next is to describe the activities I did in my beginning and intermediate Russian classes. After becoming familiar with the concept of language culture, I decided to make a concerted effort and integrate language and intercultural goals. I realized that cultural exploration and reflection cannot be simply appended to a language course. I see development should be purposefully integrated into language learning activities in and out of classroom. I also wanted to make sure that both types of goals are reflected in my teaching and assessment. In doing so, I did not invent a bicycle. I just looked at the typical activities that I used over the years to promote teaching culture and made sure that my students' learning about Russian cultural practices extends to understanding and interpreting native and target culture values and includes opportunities for reflection. And to do that, I needed to provide specific tasks that would make students notice, analyze, evaluate, and reflect on cultural perspectives presented in each activity. I wanted to go beyond the mere presentation of facts and invite students not only to observe the target culture, but to explore it, to consider cultural similarities and differences in an intentional way, and hopefully begin to develop intercultural understanding and skills in the context of language learning. So I'm going to tell you what I did and what I observed. I will start with a couple of long-term projects and then move on to some in-class activities. This is telecollaboration. Telecollaboration is described as internet-based computer-mediated teaching that brings together different groups of foreign language learners. Telecollaboration is a popular way of fostering IC development. In fact, many definitions of telecollaboration describe it as an online intercultural exchange and mention intercultural purposes in addition to language skills. There is much research on the positive effects of telecollaboration, such as development of oral and written communication, improved motivation, promotion of student-centered learning, opportunity for equal participation, and the satisfaction students experience from learning about the target culture. These benefits inspired me to actually do a key PAL project with my intermediate Russian class. The key to a successful telecollaboration project is to know the instructor on the other side, or better yet, to be friends with them. And it so happened that a very good friend of mine teaches English in gymnasium number 2 in the city of Tula. I reached out to her, described the project, and she agreed to carry it out from her end. So we paired 8 American college students with Russian 11th graders for weekly email exchanges. Students used a combination of interview-type questions and answers to get acquainted with the partners and discuss the topics of mutual interest: schoolwork, music, sports, movies. My students also did some brainstorming in class to create a list of questions about culture. And they came up with things like, what stereotypes do you know that exist about your culture? What stereotypes do you know that exist about American culture? What values and norms are important in your culture? Do you feel like your culture is changing in any way? We had a list of things to ask, and you'll have more. You'll have a description of the project in the handout. So I have to say that while Russian key pals were proficient enough to discuss both personal and culture topics in English, my students used Russian for familiar everyday topics and English for cultural discussion, which helped a lot with their input and understanding of cultural matters. They just wouldn't be able to do that in Russian, even after 2 years of studying the language. For my students, the KeepL project was part of their regular homework, which was worth 25% of the grade. A minimum of 2 emails per week was required. It was graded on completion, non-completion. I did not grade on grammatical correctness. And in fact, I didn't have to, because Russian and American partners pointed out each other mistakes and provided corrections. So accuracy was taken care of without my intervention. My students were also required to participate in a weekly online discussion to share what they learned about and from their partners. This was my chance to see if and how their experience added to or changed their previous understanding of Russia and Russians, and I also wanted to keep them accountable. To support the intercultural goals of the activity, I asked to respond to questions such as, did the email exchange provide any insights into Russian as well as your own cultural rules and biases? How did it affect your beliefs about Russian as well as American culture? And did you discover any significant differences? So this weekly online discussion also allowed me to provide guidance and feedback on the spot, as well as do some dynamic and ongoing assessment. On the slide, you see just one quote from a student online discussion where they talk how the interaction with a Russian peer inspired intercultural observation, evaluation, and comparison. At the end of the quarter, my student prepared a 3-minute informal individual presentation. And during these presentations, they had another chance to comment on the connections they made between the two cultures, to reflect aloud on their discoveries and how they changed their view of Russia. It was fascinating to see how their exchanges on everyday topics like holidays and food how their exchanges on everyday topics ended up in quite a deep reflection that touched on some really important issues. In their course evaluation, students said that the best thing was that we were talking with real people, not some textbook characters. I got a glimpse of Ulyana and her family's life. It's very different from mine, and I appreciate it. And I learned a lot about Russian values, and it changed my outlook completely. To me, the student statements indicate that the beginning of the attitude transformation, an important step towards intercultural competence. Students also noted that now they have language, actual words and expressions to talk about complex topics like cultural stereotyping in Russian. One of my students actually visited her KeepL in Tula during her study abroad in Russia. She traveled to Tula by herself to stay with the family for a couple of days. My teacher friend from Tula reported that her students enjoyed the project immensely. Unlike my students, they volunteered. They didn't have to do it. It wasn't a class requirement for the Russian side. And mainly they enjoyed it because it was the first opportunity for them to communicate with real-life Americans. There were a lot of comments about better understanding, similar interests, and even very different from what I saw on TV. I highly recommend a telecollaboration project as an effective way of fostering intercultural competence. An email exchange like I did is probably the least technologically and logistically complex way of using telecollaboration. So I suggest starting small, something like that, with a simple project, and gradually build on complexity and technology. In your handout, you will see a reference to another project. It's called Connecting Classrooms, which is on the other end of the complexity spectrum. Their project took 2 years to complete, and they used several different communication tools for maximum student benefit. But one important consideration here is not to let technology overshadow the intercultural and linguistic goals of your activity. Another long-term project, also for second-year Russian students, is proverbs and sayings. Proverbs are often used to teach culture to foreign language students because of the significant role they play in everyday life in the target culture. Many scholars believe that studying folklore can help establish cross-cultural understanding based on respect for differences and acknowledgement of similarities of the two cultures, which is exactly what I want to achieve in my class. But for this to happen, we need to make this process of cross-cultural comparison visible, to bring it to the public domain of the classroom. Just like with the email exchange project, my goal here was twofold. I wanted to meet language objectives and to integrate intercultural development as well. I gave students a list of websites on Russian proverbs and sayings. Alternatively, they could search for русские пословицы, народные пословицы и поговорки. After choosing the one that they liked, they had to provide the English equivalent or a passable translation, asking native speakers for help or checking the internet. Everything was allowed. Then they had to describe in writing a situation, either real life or imaginary, in which a particular proverb could be used. You see a sample on the slide. Students were also required to read and comment on their classmates' entries, and this was the linguistic part of the assignment. My cultural objectives included for students to become familiar with an important part of Russian culture beyond the textbook, or the 5 Fs, in the hope that they would develop appreciation for the depth of content, imagery, and folk wisdom of Russian proverbs. To make cultural objectives explicit, I specifically asked students to focus on the Russian cultural values reflected in the proverbs and discuss if any of these values were shared by American people as expressed in American sayings. Often in online discussion, I would ask, как в Америке, американцы тоже так do, to nudge them in the right direction. The project made up 50% of the final grade, 10 for students' original writing, and 5 for commenting on classmates' posts. Points were awarded for substantial comments that address the cultural values and symbols found in the proverbs or provide some cross-cultural comparison. So something like очень хорошо would not count towards the final grade. It was a quarter-long project, which we carried out completely online. At the beginning, I posted a sample proverb entry so that students knew what was expected from them, and we got the ball rolling. Students posted a new entry every week, and they commented on each other's posts in Russian and in English. And I was glad to see they all said that they found the project challenging but enjoyable, and they saw benefits for both the language and the understanding of culture. They noted their focus on spiritual rather than material aspects of the Russian being, the importance of hard work, acceptance of responsibility, traditional Russian values of optimism and friendship and communalism. Many students commented on Christian images, Bog, Божий, Господь, and were associated with Russian Orthodox tradition, and were glad for the opportunity to learn the vocabulary. In their comments, students referred to similar American sayings and shared cultural values, family, religion, hard work, and in doing so, they considered their own language and cultural background. Some students said that they use Russian proverbs in the flow of English speech when they speak English, which makes them feel more Russian. Overall, the project was a success. Another long-term project that combined language and cultural learning and gave me sufficient assessment opportunities was devoted to Russian art. Researchers believe that the study of the artistic expression of ideas, emotions, and opinions can be an important way of understanding the target cultural canon and its reflection of the national consciousness. And yet it is almost never used in Russian language textbooks. As always the case with long-term projects, we start with a class discussion of the cultural significance of art. I explain the requirements and the evaluation criteria. And show my sample text. Students receive a list of links to Russian paintings from different periods and genres. The list is in your handout, and if you look at the pictures that I chose, you will see that I was going for paintings that had a clear narrative content. That is, students can tell a story based on an action, situation, or event and describe it in concrete terms. Students, it was the oral final exam. So students paired up to research a painting, the painting, the artist, and the time period, and save time because they were in pairs. And then they would present their findings in Russian to the class. Each pair member had 3 minutes to speak. Their presentation should include 3 grammatical tenses, be accompanied by a visual aid, slides or a poster, and be told rather than read. Their classmates get bonus points if they ask questions about the painting. This is a very popular project, second only to the email exchange, which is the utmost champion of all the projects that we did. Students love to work with authentic materials. They feel that they gain knowledge, become aware of the cultural values behind the paintings, and expand their own cultural base. In a question and answer exchange after each presentation, students note intercultural similarities and contrasts. Some of the popular ones are meals, food in general, attitude to wars, territory expansion in the Russian and American cultures, Christian imagery. Students also comment on their own cultural assumptions. So painting presentations are a perfect opportunity for formative assessment and for providing additional input and feedback, which complements the summative evaluation based on the rubric. I also want to mention blogging as a possible activity for raising intercultural awareness. Blogs have become a popular means of self-expression in a foreign language. My students often start a blog to describe and reflect on their experiences during study abroad. Of course, it's a pre-COVID activity, no study abroad now. Their blog posts usually describe encounters with native speakers and places they visited, often accompanied by pictures. For the most part, they write in English, their native language, and their accounts can be quite detailed and passionate. And yet they seldom extend from noticing cultural phenomena and patterns of communication to evaluation, analysis, and reflection associated with intercultural competence. To bring intercultural awareness to a new level, bloggers need to be reminded to write critically and to do some reflective analysis as they describe their experience with the target culture. This reflection provides an opportunity for students to deal with intercultural aspects of communication in a conscious way, to make sense of their cultural observations as they consider their target language perspective and develop their own. Here are two excerpts from recent study abroad blogs, 2018, 2019, and both capture the process of intercultural comparison, and I numbered the instances of comparison, evaluation, acceptance, and adapting with numbers. So they're from 2 different students, and both capture the process of intercultural comparison, evaluation, acceptance of the Russian cultural norms, and adapting one's own behavior accordingly. I'll give you a couple of seconds to read it. A study abroad blog is not a required curricular activity, and I never make my students to do something like that. And yet many of them appreciate having a real life audience, and they're looking forward to comments on their blog posts. So if my students decide to keep a study abroad blog, they usually send me an invitation. And in my comments to their entries, I encourage the writer to reflect on the intercultural experience abroad. I also ask for the author's permission to show the blog to the class I'm teaching at the moment, and usually they agree. Individual blogs have several uses in a Russian class. Blogs are read by the author's US classmates who write comments and questions to their posts in English or Russian. As students read their peers' accounts on cultural encounters and reactions, they get valuable cultural information and learn about the writer's perspective on a given topic. Blog entries can spark a class discussion on culture. Some intercultural exchanges described in posts can be acted out in a role play. We actually did the greetings and the greenhouse tour scenario in one of my classes. Best of all, blogs afford me a unique glimpse of the writer's intercultural processes as well as various opportunities for formative assessment, feedback, and guidance through the blog's comment function. Let me stop here again and ask for questions. Questions or comments? Katya says that her sister kept a blog when she went to France and she used it in her French classes all the time. I would love to do the same with a Russian blog. Exactly. Some of my students did a virtual study abroad this year, but there were no blog invitations. Thank you so much, Yulia. Thank you. Like I said, I'm not making up anything new. I see that people are using blogging and other activities too. It's just that this focus on the intercultural aspect of language, locating the cultural expressions and making them public, bringing them to students, making them visible. Yulia, how would you go about finding pen key pals on the high school level? My students' key pals were high school, 11th graders, high schoolers. Like I said, it really helps if you know somebody, reaching out to the professional community, asking your friends if they know somebody who teaches English in Russia, and reaching out to these people. Personal connection really helps. I think that maybe a conference for teachers of Slavic ETSIL conference can be a great place to make new acquaintances and to establish contacts with somebody who teaches in Russia. I have connections in Kazakhstan. They all speak Russian, so if you're interested, I can hook you up with high school students from Kazakhstan. My email is on the handout and also at the beginning, at the end of slides, and just send me an email if you need something from me. For some shy students, would it work better to use a private blog or a blog within ULMS? Some students feel intimidated by doing something on internet. Absolutely, my students have the same concerns, and but there are functions that, restrict privacy, and students can control who sees their blogs. By all means, if they don't feel comfortable with the entire world seeing their entries, let them use something private. And don't forget to ask their permission to show their writing to the class that you are teaching now. Figures that have become signatures of Russian culture, writers, composers, painters, and start from there. Absolutely. You know, what I'm showing you is just a template or just some ideas that can be expanded and developed. Daria, by all means, please email me. Discussion boards again. Ira, would you like to talk about your proverbs, proverb of the week?
I have 2% left on my notebook, so I'm afraid if I'm cut off, this is what will happen. This is the reason why I'm not turning on my camera either right now. This was actually, I think, Katya, it was after one of your presentations at one of the conferences. I thought about it, and I started giving it. Sometimes I forget. There are years when I forget to do it, and then I think it also depends kind of on the synergy I have with the group. And then there are years when I do it, and this year I'm doing it. And what I'm hearing from students is that well, first of all, it really invites, like you said, it really invites the thinking about this народная мудрость, народные ценности, this ethos, this certain cultural ethos that we want to discuss. And then we start comparing it with what are some equivalent proverbs in English? What proverbs do not have an equivalent in English at all? Just the concept is not expressed. And then, of course, and in a different venue, we talked about how we also need to be careful about using proverbs that actually highlight problematic aspects of Russian culture. But I also believe that not in the first year of Russian, but if we want to engage students in the discussion of sexism, for example, or xenophobia, we could also take Russian proverbs as a starting point and help students unwrap and analyze and see how values that maybe бьет значит любит values that were promoted before I really looked down upon now. And the proverb really is, when you look at the Национальный корпус русского языка, the proverb is being used less and less these days. So this also could be an interesting discussion for these difficult issues.
And a starting point and a platform. Thank you, Ira. Let me move on, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion at the end too. So in addition, hold on a second. So in addition to quarter length, project length activities, intercultural learning and assessment opportunities can be built into everyday work, language work. What I'm going to talk about is very familiar to teachers and students as common means of learning the language and assessing what you learned, listening, speaking, and writing skills. To strengthen the intercultural component, I am trying to supplement linguistic work with deliberate comparison, discussion, and explanation of how culture is reflected in language use. These formats provide enough flexibility to address different aspects of linguistic and cultural knowledge. Once filled with appropriate content, they can be integrated into any unit of study at any level of proficiency. Most of us had at least one guest speaker in their classroom over the course of our teaching. An interview with a native Russian speaker meets linguistic as well as intercultural objectives. Students get to use language for authentic purposes, gain a first-hand insight into the life of the target language speaker and community, and hopefully enhance their understanding of the two cultures. So to prepare for a Skype or an in-person interview, my students receive an assignment worksheet, which you will find on your handout. The first task is to draw, before they actually meet the person, is to draw up a list of questions, discussion points, and relevant language expressions. And we circulate the list via email to avoid grammatical mistakes and repetitive questions, because everybody wants to ask, какую музыку вы любите? Preparing questions in advance allows my students to identify and formulate their individual interests in the target culture. And I remind them about the cross-cultural aspect of the activity. It's right there on the worksheet. So when they come up with questions, what do you think our people have in common? How could you describe a typical Russian? What should I know if I want to make Russian friends? Show students interest in intercultural understanding. But again, they need to be pointed in this direction. They need to be reminded about it. So they prepare the questions and then they talk to the person. And then there are, after the interview assignments for one of them, we record everything. We record all the entire interview, and then students are also encouraged to keep notes as they listen to the person. So after the interview, the students write vocabulary notes based on their notes and the recording. So they choose 5 words and give a meaning and provide a meaning and a sentence, sample sentence for 5 new words that they encountered. Another task is to summarize the interview in Russian. And the fourth part, the next task is a purposeful intercultural analysis in English. Students are asked to explore aspects of Russian culture they noticed during the interview and reflect on how the new information modified their previous knowledge and beliefs about Russia and their own culture. I deliberately programmed this reflective component into the activity to promote the development of a critical intercultural awareness, to elicit students' individual reactions and interpretations, and to bring to the surface the subtle matter of cultural attitudes that otherwise might, be unnoticed. The formative and summative assessment of the guest speaker interview activity is based on the worksheet, and it reflects, again, the twofold linguistic and intercultural objectives. So I look at student questions, at the vocabulary, their sentences, correctness and completeness, the summary, if they included the main points of the discussion, and the intercultural analysis, if there is evidence of noticing, questioning, connecting the two cultures. And because intercultural analysis is included into assessment, students feel obliged to do something in this respect. Analyzing audio or visual examples of authentic cultural situations for social linguistic behavior is a fancy way of referring to listening and speaking practice that we do in our classes. Very often we ask students to listen or read a dialogue like the one on the slide, and then we ask them questions to check comprehension and elicit language. And these questions can lead to an intercultural discussion as well, particularly when they accompany an audio or video clip that displays an example of social linguistic behavior. So students listen to something like that, and then they have true or false questions. Эти 2 человека знакомы. Павел приглашает Наташу в театр. Концерт начинается в 7 часов. What the dialogue says is actually часов 7. And this is a typical Russian way of conveying an approximate time of meeting, which could be interpreted as Russian somewhat relaxed attitude toward time as compared to American punctuality. We never say через 2 часа. It's always через пару часов, часа через 2-3, дней через 5, and so on. And the same goes for distance. Магазин недалеко, километра 2. So this discussion of language culture connection should complement language work. You can bring out other expressions used in the same function, talk about possible cultural motifs behind linguistic behavior, and suggest an appropriate reaction in case of misunderstanding. This deliberate inclusion of intercultural objectives along with the language work ensures that students not only understand the text, but also notice native and target cultural notions such as politeness, time, social distance, depending on the text that you have at hand. Another familiar type of questions, short answer or essay type, can be used with different kinds of input. It could be a text, an image, or an audio file. We want to use different types of questions, such as closed, open, and referential, like you see on the slide, to address different aspects of student knowledge and check students' adaptability to distinct patterns of behavior in the target culture. For example, with a picture like this one, in authentic cultural situation, you can ask, что они делают, что они говорят, как вы думаете, почему они это говорят, и а что говорят и делают американцы в такой ситуации. This is actually, I use it in the unit on asking for permission. This is what the little girl is doing. And my students wanted to usually talk here about parenting style, family interaction. Grandmothers are important, you know, generational family. All this comes up with just, you know, showing them a picture and asking a couple of questions. Solving cross-cultural conflict situations or critical incidents are types of activities that are based on cross-cultural interactions that may cause negative assumptions about the target culture. For example, a Russian student asks her American friend for help at a test in a US university, and when the friend refuses, she feels confused and hurt. Or a student invited to a dinner by a Russian family feels forced to eat everything in front of her because she's afraid to offend the host by declining the food. Yet another potentially conflict situation concerns questions about money and salary, which are quite acceptable from the Russian point of view, but are considered a personal matter in the American culture. There are several ways of using critical incidents in a Russian class. Presented with a prompt containing a conflict situation, students can provide personal responses, either orally or in writing, and describe how the situation can be resolved. They can develop the critical incident into a story or act it out in a role play. I see critical incident activities as an opportunity for students to verbalize their individual reactions, to interpret the situation their own way, and an excellent way to teach tolerance and the skill of negotiating a potential conflict in the target language. As students explain the source of misinterpretation and develop an acceptable solution to the problem, they get a deeper understanding of American and Russian cultural assumptions. Student study abroad blogs are a great source of potential conflict situations. Role-playing is another activity that we often do in class. Role plays may involve conflict situations or just general scenes students may encounter, such as requests, invitations, asking for directions. Role plays can be used to raise students' intercultural awareness as well. To do that, we want to emphasize the cultural aspect of the textbook or teacher designed situation, bring it to the foreground for students to notice and reflect upon. For example, a role play on making requests can include the fact that if you repeat your request and keep talking to an employee or an official, even after they said no, you may actually, you know, get the desired result. You just need to keep going and repeating and insisting. Or if students are practicing making and responding to compliments, they can act out a typically Russian reaction of appealing, slightly embarrassed, and declining praise, denying what has been said. For example, you say, какой вкусный салат, and here, ой, нет, мне кажется, там мало соли, in return. A role play of a host and a house guest situation may deal with the host insistently offering drinks or food, and a guest never accepting the offer right away. Such a role play can be followed by an analysis of the social dynamics of the situation and the cultural values expressed by the speaker, and it will help increase students' intercultural awareness and relate language and culture in a meaningful way. This is all I have for today. You will find more activities on the handout, which I sent through chat. I just want to stress once again that to make our students interculturally competent, we need to engage them with the Russian and American cultures beyond the presentation of facts and objects, through their individual perceptions, critical analysis, and interpretation. It doesn't mean that we need to abandon existing textbooks and our teaching practices. It means that we have to make an intentional effort and create opportunities for students to examine their beliefs and develop appreciation of their own culture at the same time as they gain insights into the target culture and learn the language that expresses it. Here are the references, and there are more references on the handout. Yeah.
Thank you, Katya.
Let me look at the chat.
Discussion of using news in Russian. And Irina, the rubric is in the document that Katya sent earlier. What is the age of your students? Asks Irina.
You know, typical Russian undergrads, all 18, 19 to 21. From time to time, I would get non-traditional students who are a little bit older, but it doesn't happen very often. I teach in a Christian school too, so you heard me talking about Christian symbols and beliefs. It's very important for my students. Лидия Краснова спрашивает насчет культурных проектов. Лидия, я не очень понимаю, что вы имеете в виду. Какие культурные проекты? We do have a Russian club. We do have a Russian club on campus, not Russian table, but Russian club, yeah. And it helps, and they invite native speakers. Спасибо, спасибо. Yulia, do you think watching news in Russia is also a way to introduce culture? And how would you use this in your classes? First of all, news, you know, hearing or reading news is authentic. Second of all, it helps with the language, especially because in case of international news, students might be familiar already with the news, so it'll be easier to understand. And then depending on what the actual piece of news leads me to, I will look for facts. I will look at how the facts are expressed in the language, and I'll bring it to students' attention. You probably noticed that as I was talking about different activities, a lot of what I do is driven by what I have at hand and how the culture is expressed in this particular material. But news definitely, and they're so accessible, and there are images, and students can listen. What a great resource.
With news, there's a question of ideology, right? And the political side.
You need to be careful, yes. You need to be careful choosing the news. And I think, well, I work with upper level classes, like teaching advanced level. And one of the aspects that we do is mass media. And we also teach political Russian course. So we have to watch news. But within the last period, within this past semesters, I choose to discuss culture mostly. You cannot discuss politics nowadays. Watching news which say show how Russians celebrate Maslenitsa, or how they celebrate Krещение, for example, or popular Russian films that are now that Russians now watch. The reaction of Russian audience to the contemporary films is also of interest.
But I wonder if there's a way to kind of approach news academically, intellectually, apply critical thinking skills, and kind of dissect them and go beyond, you know, the actual, event, but see, tell students how the ideology is woven or not woven into the news, and how the argument is constructed, what aspect of the news is presented, and maybe show a different political kind of a stand, different news from representing by different ideology, and see how they compare.
Yeah, again, you need to be very careful.
Absolutely.
So I'm sorry, I'm interjecting here. So I would not, agree with you, Yulia. So RT, I may disagree with RT, but I think, showing a variety of
Yeah.
news and positions is helpful, and
Yeah, it is, yes. But and then again, you need to comment on it, and you need to the students to understand. Yeah.
right. Because some people might, I have a student who, when he came to my classroom, he said, I want to join Russian army. I support Putin, blah, blah, blah. I want to be a Russian citizen through joining the Russian army. It's like, okay, well, you certainly have a right to to have this wish and opinion, and I don't want to brainwash you. I don't want to change your political stand. You are who you are. So yeah. There's a question about the Bible, right? Using the Bible in the...
I don't see it. Can you read it aloud?
Do you ever use the Bible in your classes? You mentioned you teach in the
I do big time. So first and second year, because we're a Christian school, I approach it as I would any text. I search for online for fragments that contain vocabulary like domes, for something that will be relevant to the unit in Troika that we're studying now. And I bring a couple of lines to class. We read it aloud together for pronunciation. We try to translate it together. We talk about the context and the content and the culture and everything. And again, it takes time away from the case system and the verbs, but my students want it, they really appreciate it. And I know that if they do some of the Bible, they would be more motivated to study grammar. So yeah. Just, just comparing the vocabulary, English and Russian, and tracing everything to Greek, it's very interesting.
Sophia adds, anything to avoid in the Bible or while teaching it?
I don't know. We're a Christian school. What to avoid? I don't do any theology in my classes. Like I said, I approach it as a text. No, you scared me. What should I be avoiding?
You should be
doing something wrong.
Okay. Elena adds that on a higher level, it's possible to use different media for comparison of different points of view. Official Russian mainstream media versus the sources expressing a position. Certainly.
Well, possibly different media for comparison of different points. I think so. Yes. Why not? And then bring your own opinion and ask students for their opinion and have a debate.
Right.
By all means, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can do it with a lower level if you just look at the zaголовки. If you just look at the headlines themselves.
Yeah, yes. We do it a lot, yes. When you try to use the authentic material as much as you can in class, yes. Even in the elementary level. Shopping, for example, you go to Yandex and you look for stuff the students want to buy, for example, in Russian online stores.
There was a question about non-traditional students, Olga. how do you differentiate? Do you choose different types of cultural materials? No, I don't. I don't differentiate. And I think they don't want to be singled out because they feel awkward as is because they're older. So we all learn from the same syllabus and the same materials, and everybody is, you know, doing it in my class together.
All right, colleagues, it's almost 7 p.m.
4
Eastern
o'clock
time.
in Seattle. I just
Yeah.
want to thank everybody for sitting through it for an hour and a half and paying attention, asking wonderful questions, making comments, keeping the discussion going. I would love to continue the conversation, so email me if you want to take it further. Thank you so much. And thank you, Zhenya, Ira, for organizing and for asking